not uncommon.
Well, I mean, it's easy to do.
Yeah.
You know, politics. Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the photo ID law and legislative redistricting takes to the Supreme Court. Then we have Tim Potts, one of Pennsylvania's leading reformers, on the second half of the program. What, a burglary in the Harrisburg Democratic headquarters? What's that about? Pennsylvania politics and government in depth and in detail. And guess what? It all starts right now.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I want to thank Matt Belanger from WGAL News 8 for sitting in for me while I was covering the national conventions. And now on to the big issues of the day. Amy Worden is here from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Keegan Gibson. He's the managing editor of PoliticsPA.com. Amy Worden, what was going on in Harrisburg this past week? Watergate? Another Watergate? Tell us about that.
Well, it's not quite breaking news, Terry. Actually, this happened last month. But
last month?
Yes.
But you just all reported on it.
Well, we don't know. There's no real good explanation for that. But last month, somebody broke into the Democratic Party headquarters in Harrisburg and walked out with 2 laptops and a camcorder. And for anyone who remembers Watergate, this was sounding vaguely like Watergate on the Susquehanna.
And what?
Well, what struck me as a little bit funny about the whole thing is the police report said that the break-in happened no earlier than 10 a.m. Monday morning or whatever the day was. And I was just thinking to myself, had it been Republican headquarters, they would have said no earlier than 7 in the morning, because that's when the GOP gets to. All
right, let's go to the big issue. There is no doubt a nationally covered story, the photo ID law. Amy, what are the parameters of that? What are sort of the big 3 or 4 things that our viewers ought to know about that?
Well, basically, you have a new law in Pennsylvania that requires voters who, in November to go to the polling places with a state-approved photo ID, and there are a range of them. The most obvious being, of course, your driver's license. But it became immediately apparent and became a source of contention and then a lawsuit over the fact that many people, particularly elderly, disabled, urban voters, minority voters, do not have photo ID, and that the hurdles to get that ID were excessive, and thus the basis for the lawsuit. And
so in the defense of the state on this issue, just if it can be defended, and I'm not going to get into that, I'm going to be neutral on this, is that they've made Herculean efforts since then to try to make sure that people are aware of what they have to do in order to qualify.
Yeah, I think that the first case when this was tried in a lower court was sort of a wake-up call to the state, and since then they've really put their pedal to the metal on efforts to make it easier for people to get ID and to advertise the fact that they'll need ID to vote. So the state has really tried to push in the month and a half that they've had to try to make this easier as possible, for a lot of the voters.
Now, go ahead.
Yeah, the premise for this law, of course, was to prevent voter fraud. Right. However, the state, both sides in this case, the state included, going into the initial hearing of the voter ID case, where the law was upheld, by the way, basically conceded that yes, there has been no evidence of voter fraud.
But it was also said, I think the argument that the lawyers on behalf of the Commonwealth and Commonwealth folks have been saying is that it's to prevent fraud, right? Mm-hmm. It's to prevent what could be fraud. Yeah,
there's long been a belief, especially in Republican circles, that in Philadelphia particularly, election officials there turn a blind eye towards wrongdoing. So even though there hasn't been a documented instance of somebody pretending to be another person in person at the polls, they believe that this sort of measure will help prevent that kind of thing just as a blanket in the future.
The big question, of course, before the House, so to speak, is 2 numbers, 3 and 3. Right. That's been explain that to our viewers.
Well, the case is now today before the state Supreme Court, and which right now is evenly divided, Republican and Democrat, 3-3. If it is in fact an even split, then the lower court ruling supporting the law stays.
Okay, let's run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about a couple of different things. The legislature, is it full-time or part-time? Amy, you wrote about that. And Keegan, the other big question in state politics is, are we still a battleground state, given the fact that television commercials have been pulled out of the state? All right, we'll be back for the second part of Pennsylvania Newsmakers following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business.
We do this differently.
You were able to get Jeff Coleman.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by BetterSaferRoads.com. To voice your support for safer highways and less traffic congestion, visit BetterSaferRoads.com. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hi, welcome back to the program with Amy Worden with the Philadelphia Inquirer and Keegan Gibson with PoliticsPA.com. Amy, you wrote a story this past week about the Pennsylvania Legislature and the number of days they're in session. I'll ask Tim Potts and I can follow up on some of the reform measures he's been talking about. How many days are they in 6 months? You wrote about this. Go ahead.
Right. Well, a grand total of 60 days of session, of voting session days.
60 days.
The entire year. Correct. Yes. Which is about the same number that Maryland, which is a part-time legislature, met this year.
And there is a bill in the legislature, I think, pushed by a Lancaster County lawmaker,
right,
who thinks the legislature ought to be part-time.
Right.
They have 3,000 employees. Not going to diss the employees. I think, state government employees generally work harder than I think a lot of people give them credit for. I'm not going to go there and do that at all. 3,000 employees working for 253 people. Do I got that about right?
Well, actually, I just did the math in the course of reporting this story, and in fact, there are about 500 fewer employees.
Wow.
So they have in fact reduced their budgets, and they have reduced their staffing over the last few years as part of the reform movement in the legislature.
Okay.
So I will give them that.
All right. But there is some concern by folks that they're not in session enough. That coming back from virtually off the entire summer. Now, they'll say they're doing constituent service and committee meetings and all that, but they're in session from between Labor Day, let's say, and Election Day. Is it 8 or 9 days? Am I in the right ballpark?
Right. This fall, they're only back about 8 or 9 days, and then they break again for close to 3 months, again, until the session begins in January.
Your eyes are going there. All right. Before you all get out of here, I don't know if you want to comment about that at all, but if not, I do want to ask you about the big stories the past week, all of the TV commercials from both Obama, Romney, the super PACs for both sides gone from Pennsylvania. That's probably the first time in modern history that's happened. What's the story?
For the first time since May, as of this past weekend, there is not any national group or presidential campaign on television in Pennsylvania. Obama hasn't been on. His super PAC friends have been on for a long time. Romney hasn't, but it's basically been a battle of the super PACs. They're gone now, and the reason why is because they're not getting as much bang for their buck. Pennsylvania is an expensive state to advertise in, and Obama's consistently leading 7 to 8 points in the polls. So they think
I don't want to pick on
elsewhere.
Amy's newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, or Philadelphia, but the television market, the fourth largest market in the country, is expensive. Yeah. But it reaches 40% of the voters of the state. So this is a decision made by the campaigns, and Romney never put any money into the state at all. We were the most televised state in terms of money in 2008 in the entire presidential election. Obama spent $40 million here. Are they coming back? What do you think?
We'll be competitive we'll be in the top 10 probably, because the groups have already spent 15 to 20 million on the air just already. I think for them to come back, it's going to take some sort of national movement behind Romney, where his numbers just go up across the board, and then they come back and take another look.
Before we go, I do have legislative redistricting. It was struck down by the Supreme Court on this split municipality. That's also before the Supreme Court of this state as we speak, right?
Correct. Right. Yeah. So again, another monumental challenge and very controversial case before the Supreme Court to decide, whether in fact the current legislative maps that are supposed to be based on the census numbers and will hold for another 10 years are in fact constitutional.
Yeah. Now, Keegan, the issue here is the number of split municipalities. Yeah. Go ahead. Do you want to explain that?
Well, so lawmakers every 10 years draw up new maps based on population changes, and they almost always do it to try. Democrats try to draw Democratic favoring maps. Republicans do the same thing. This time, the Republicans put forth a map. This is for state legislators, state senators, that the Supreme Court earlier in the year said was just so wacky and so crazy that it just couldn't stand. So they tossed it out. Now legislators have a new map in front of them.
Right.
It cuts down on the number of municipal
fewer split municipalities. Right. And the House Democrats actually support the plan, right?
Yeah, the leader of the House Democrats voted in favor of it. The leader of the Senate Democrats voted against it.
Yeah. Now, in the court decision that took place originally, a Republican member of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice Ron Castillo, voted with the Democrats to send it back. So I get the sense, Amy, I think you would agree, there's going to be a lot of eyes on what the Chief Justice does, right?
Well, absolutely. And now we have a 3-3 rather than a 7-member court, as we did.
Explain that. Why we only have 6 and not 7 members of the Supreme Court.
Right. Well, one of the members of the Supreme Court, Joan Ori Melvin, has been suspended because of she's under a question involving a corruption
the prosecution
charge
against her for using care staff for campaign purposes, something illegal. She's suspended. She's suspended. So for our viewers, 3 Ds, 3 Rs, and if we get split decisions on.
Yeah, if it's a split decision
on this one and
also on voter ID,
and there's at least one other big issue, Marcellus Shale. So a lot of exciting stuff going on. It's now shifted to the courts from the state legislature. All right, Tim Potts, we're going to talk about his ideas for legislative reform, what's going on in the state capitol otherwise, when we return.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source.
Yeah, I love this list. I mean, I think we just go.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education. 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Tim Potts from Democracy Rising joins me. Tim has been one of the leading advocates for reform in the state capitol. Tim, welcome as always.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Good to be with you.
All right, let's go through a list of things that you've identified and others have identified as sort of big issues that the legislature could take up that would, change some of the way in which it conducts business, permits more voter involvement and input. Let's start, first of all, when a candidate runs for governor or a statewide office, but then files, if he's a lawmaker, for his legislative office, both simultaneously.
Right.
Good or bad idea? Bad
idea. And, the folks in Pennsylvania really think that's a bad idea. 87% say that public officials should have to resign from the current office in order to run for a different office. And a lot of good reasons for that. You're basically subsidizing their campaign with taxpayer money. And you're also giving short shrift to the job you were elected to perform, because you cannot serve full-time in a public office and campaign full-time simultaneously. You just can't do it.
Now, if you run for a federal office, you can't run for a state office at the same time.
Correct.
Except for vice president and president, I guess, right, if you want to run for
there are always exceptions.
All right. We are not among a couple of dozen states that allow voters to initiate legislation to repeal legislation, as we know well from things that have gone on in Colorado and California and other states.
Right.
Say something about those proposals.
Well, that's initiative, referendum, and recall. And the important thing isn't that necessarily that 87, 88% of the people want these things. It's what's behind that, and it's the lack of accountability. People think that having elections every 2 years for the legislature, every 4 years for Senate and governor, is simply not sufficient as an opportunity to hold public officials accountable. So they want these tools. If there were other ways to do it, I think people wouldn't like this so much.
And Pennsylvania is one of the few states in which, except for a handful of items that legally are required, the voters of the state don't get to directly vote on initiatives,
Exactly.
Big issues that come before the state, policy issues that matters to a lot of people, right?
Well, the only time we get to vote on policy issues is when we vote to whether to amend the Constitution or not. And of course, we still have, by 3-to-1 margin, people in Pennsylvania want to have a Constitution convention so that they can repair a government that's conspicuously broken.
All right. One of the criticisms over the years that has been, I think, most articulated by folks has to do with campaign financing, the way campaigns are run.
Yes.
We're one of the few states in which there's no limit on what you can give to a candidate, and almost no limit on what they can spend it on. I think the law says to influence an election.
But that law's never enforced.
Yeah, I was going. Go ahead. Talk
I mean,
a little bit.
it just isn't. Well, this is another one. 88% favor changing our campaign finance laws. Only 7% oppose. Think that the laws are good the way they are. We ought to be able to get this done. We have a lot of other states that do it much better than we do. And it also has to do with reporting campaign expenditures.
You have to report, if Tim Potts gives to a candidate, the candidate has to report that once it's above a certain threshold, right?
Right. And part of the problem is you get within 6 or 8 weeks of an election, you have a filing deadline. If you miss that, the penalty's only $10 a day. So you end up paying $200 or something as a fine and keep your opponent completely in the dark. Yeah. That's a business decision. Anybody would do that.
But we do have at least a reporting law. If Tim Potts gives, let's say, $200 hypothetically to a candidate, the candidate has to report that Tim Potts gave $200. But the bigger problem is you can give any amount of money anytime you want, and they can use it for almost anything they want.
Exactly.
Did I misrepresent that?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, we have a few seconds left in this segment. There are a bunch of other things I want to. Well, let's run to a break. When we come back, there are 3 or 4 other big things I want to talk with you about. Okay. Back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Welcome back to the program. I'm talking about Tim Potts, who has a lot of ideas about ways in which to reform business in the state capitol, politics, government in general. One of the areas that you've shown some interest in fact, a lot of people have shown interest in this, has to do with lobbying law and what lobbyists can do and to give to lawmakers. They have to report them above a certain threshold again.
Which is an extraordinarily high threshold.
But there's no limit, as I understand it, so you could take, if you're a lobbyist, you could take a lawmaker to the Caribbean for 2 weeks and pay for their expenses.
As long as you report it. As long as you report it, it's perfectly legal, which is something that most Pennsylvanians don't like.
Yeah. So the question then is, should, and other states do, should there be, look, I can't be opposed. I don't think it's wrong to have somebody go out and buy a dinner. It's the excesses, beyond a certain. You don't buy a vote for dinner.
Right.
You don't buy somebody goes out and plays a round of golf or, a little set of Texas.
But you do get your phone call returned as opposed to the other guy's phone call.
But there's always going to be some aspect of that. But the point is, and at least you may disagree with me on that, but there ought to be at least some upper, we ought to agree that beyond a certain point, they shouldn't be able to do it. No?
Well, if you look at what the citizens want, 93%, I mean, this is a number that's unheard of, 93% want to prohibit all public officials, not just legislators, all public officials, from taking anything of value from people trying to influence their decisions.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
That sounds perfectly reasonable to me, because as soon as you say, well, we're going to have a threshold of $50, right? Sometime in the middle of the night when they're passing the budget and everybody's asleep, somebody will put in an amendment and they'll bump that up to 100 or 250. They can't be trusted with anything that's subtle. You need to say this is the rule and that's it.
Another concern that some folks have has to do with what we call ballot access, the ease with which you can have a third party or somebody could run as an independent candidate. Pennsylvania is known as a tough ballot access state, meaning very tough to qualify to vote. So what is it that could be done? Both parties agree they don't want third parties. They don't like it. They battle it out among themselves.
Right.
So any effort being made at all to change ballot access, to limit the number of petitions, that are required in order to qualify?
Right. Yeah, there are efforts, but they typically go nowhere. There are a couple of people in the legislature who really do want to make it a lot easier for third-party and independent candidates to get on the ballot. And there's a perfectly good reason for that. We get to November 6th, and half of the legislative seats are uncontested.
Right.
If you make it easier for third-party and independents, at least you give voters a chance for a discussion about issues, and maybe even a chance to vote somebody in who, doesn't represent the major parties.
One of the issues that we've talked about on this program over the years, and there have been multiple polls that signify this, has to do with one of the important needs that doesn't seem to get met at the moment, and that's transportation funding. It's been estimated that, and the folks that I've had on the show who are really knowledgeable about this say we need about $1.7 billion a year for a lengthy period of time, and now maybe a 1 or 2 time infusion of $3 billion, that we have 25% of our bridges structurally in disrepair, something like 7,000 miles of roads in this state, not new ones, just to construct. We all riding on these roads. Governor's Commission says 3 or 4 things we can do. Nothing happens.
Right. Well, in terms of both public integrity and the transportation issue, it's not just the legislature, it's the governor. The governor promised that he was going to do an integrity agenda, and he's done none of it.
Right.
And he's come in, he appoints a commission, same as Governor Rendell did before him. They come up with basically the same stuff, and for 2 years, he does nothing. And you go, why is this? Well, because apparently the governor thinks that Grover Norquist runs Pennsylvania instead of folks here,
No tax. Well, but some of them would be fees, motor license fees and registration fees.
Sure.
Not arguably a tax or not a tax.
Right.
But you agree that, just from your sense, not just in the polls, but this is a huge priority this state is missing?
Oh, absolutely. You can't drive around Pennsylvania as much as you do and I do and a lot of other people do and not notice that there are some serious, serious problems, in some places aggravated by the Marcellus shale industry.
Okay, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your insights. All right, as always, thanks for watching Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and stay well.